Close on student activism at Jackson State. Peoples talks about the student movement, and this is his words from his book. The clenched fist salute was to be at Jackson State for a while. This is after the Gibbs Green killing. The clenched fist salute is that salute you see Tommy Green doing it with the Olympics. So he said for the next 5 years after 1970, when the Star Spangled Banner was sung or the national any student assemblies, all students gave the clenched fist salute, head down salute. So what we see at Jackson State in the late 60s is what we began to see in South Africa in the late 60s. Steve Biko, he was the founder of the South African Students Organization. Its philosophy was called Black Consciousness. It was founded in 1968, and it had its influence from the Black Power era here in the United States. Unfortunately, Biko was assassinated in 1977. His organization was banned in 1977. So the techniques, the sit-ins, the demonstrations, we fast forward that to South Africa, we go across the Atlantic, we see the same techniques used in South Africa to destroy apartheid as the students used in the United States to destroy Jim Crow. A couple more points, and we can have a conversation. Some other techniques. There was an underground newspaper at Jackson State called the Gadfly, and it was produced to inspire Black consciousness. Black is beautiful. It was produced to taunt the state college board, taunt those administrators who didn't support civil rights. So this was underground. It could not be on top. In South Africa, there was an underground student newspaper called Spear for the same reason. Spear would put up handwritten notices the night before a protest. They would put it up, they would plaster the university with these notices saying, class boycott tomorrow, don't go to class, or else. And students would heed these instructions from this unknown group. You know, the political groupings knew who it was, but the student masses don't know who were writing these notices. So one incident in South Africa where a student did not heed the call of Spear, they went to class. And he went back to his dorm room to find that it was burnt. The students had threw a Molotov cocktail into the dorm room because the student did not heed to this notice that said, don't go to class. So student protests had a devastating impact on both apartheid and Jim Crow. It affected national policy. Let me see, Peoples talks about visiting Nixon after the Gibbs Green incident, and they were visiting the White House to discuss the problem of student unrest and police violence on Black college campuses. This is 1970. They had the same discussions at that level in South Africa at the national level because it was affecting change. These students on their campuses, through protests, demonstrations, sit-ins, were now affecting national policy. And I think I want to end right there. I'll end right there. Any questions?
Yeah, the anti-apartheid movement and the civil rights movement occurring at the same time, do you suppose that there was some type of link between this or merely coincidental?
Okay, not really at the same time. The anti-apartheid movement went on up through the 90s. Civil rights movement, of course, stopped in early 70s, late 60s with the Black Power movement. Was it intentional? I don't think so. I don't think it was intentional, but there was influence. For example, in my research, I ran across a document. We all know Andrew Young. He was very instrumental in the civil rights movement. He visited South Africa. He also visited Robert Sobukwe. Sobukwe was in prison he was on house arrest, actually. He was in prison on Robben Island, but eventually they put him away at a house where he could have no visitors, no political contact. But anyway, Andrew Young visited South Africa. And he met Sobukwe's children, and he paid for their tuition to come to the United States and go to school. So there was that contact between African Americans and South Africans. But the anti-apartheid movement lasted much longer than the civil rights movement, I would think. 90s, well, a different era. Anti-apartheid movement ended in the 90s. Civil rights movement starting after World War II, ending in the late 70s. So, to answer your question. Okay.
And looking at the two different plans for the Fort Hare University in 1960, what was it about the European plan that led for it to, be selected over the more African one? And do you then believe that that would have been reversed, that perhaps may not have, led to the need for such outcomes?
All right, I got you. Good question. Basically funding. The African plan, those Africans who proposed the university, they ran out of funding. And ultimately, when you run out of money and you're trying to build something as a collective, you tend to bicker. And then the bickering ultimately made that organization collapse. But the European plan, it did have Africans involved in it. It did have community buy-in. They had one well-known guy in the community named Jababu. He was well respected, and they put him out front in their plan. And ultimately, the community caught on and were on board with it. So ultimately, it was funding that didn't make the African plan happen. Yes.
I heard you say that the American civil rights movement influenced the activities in South Africa. Is that correct? How they went about it, the sit-ins and the nonviolent protests. Mm-hmm. Was there influence the other way?
Let's see. What I was speaking of was the Black Power movement influencing the Black consciousness movement, and this is the later part of the civil rights movement. Steve Biko would be, I guess, our Stokely Carmichael. Stokely Carmichael, of course, Black Power. He was one of SNCC's chairpersons at one time. He was in the Black Panther Party. So he was nationalist, he was pro-Black. Steve Biko was that person in South Africa. So, of course, we didn't have internet back then. We didn't have TV. Well, we did have TV. But news spread, and people traveled. So, and there were books. Was it vice versa? Did the protests in South Africa influence activism here in the United States? That's a good question. People here in the United States were aware of apartheid in South Africa. Now later on, the anti-apartheid movement grew. So you had a lot of anti-apartheid protests here in the United States. A lot of it was led by African Americans. One was Randall Robinson, Trans Africa. They led the movement, the anti-apartheid movement, and they helped United States corporations divest from South Africa. So I think it was a two-way street. Maybe not exactly at the same time period, but definitely I think it was a two-way street. Because students here knew about Steve Biko in South Africa in the 70s. They knew about Nelson Mandela being locked up right now. So, yeah. Any more questions, please?
Could you talk a little bit about incremental change? You talked about the protests both at Fort Hare and at JSU, a culture of protest, a culture of resistance, you called it. I'm wondering if there were any parallels in terms of either incremental change, for example, a series of protests targeting not the major edifice of apartheid, but particular policies within the university which were successful, for example, in diversifying the student body or in some other form of administrative policy, and if there are any parallels between the two movements in that regard.
Good question. In South Africa, University of Fort Hare. Now, it was, we call it higher education apartheid up until the 90s. Now, as it increased, 80s, 90s, student resistance intensified. Faculty and staff began to join the students. So one policy change is that there was a black faculty union. I might be getting the name mixed up, but for the most part, a black faculty staff union. And they ensured that the Afrikaner administration left. How did they do this? They joined the students in protests. They also boycotted work. And they said that if we don't have a change in administration, that we will begin to resign. And some did. And this was the late 80s. So we're getting closer to the end of apartheid. And ultimately, the government was forced to make these apartheid sympathetic administrators resign. So that's one policy change. At Jackson State. Peoples talks about this in his book. He talks about tactfully working with the state college board. At one time, and I have it written here, they told him that, let me find it for you, because it hits on that question. Okay. They had, at the state college board here in Mississippi, they had a special committee for, they call them Negro colleges, for the black colleges. Y'all gonna laugh. Then they call it the Special Education Committee. And this is where the black universities met. You know, they had to meet, they couldn't meet with the white presidents. They had to meet in their own Special Education Committee. So Peoples, it wasn't a protest, it was more tactful. He walked into the white meeting and he just surprised them and kind of sat down and said, "I'm here for the meeting." And we think that since it's post Jim Crow, that we should